debate around this. This is a really important piece of legislation, I believe. It's a first step in actually legislating some space for legal cannabis use and production. We will hear from the panelists as to whether it's a good step or not, but it's a first step. So I think we should appreciate the sort of significance of that. And yeah, and that makes it worth engaging with and discussing and thinking about. I want to note at the beginning that we have invited people from the Department of Justice to present their views. We had some interaction with them and they declined, saying that they would only engage in the parliamentary process, consultation process. So, but we reach out to them, we engage with them, and they're waiting to share in the parliamentary process. So fair enough. And we also did extend an invitation to all members of the Portfolio Committee on Justice and Correctional Services, who will be deliberating on this bill in the first step of the parliamentary process. If any of them are here, they're very welcome. But I also want others to know that we did extend that invitation. But we're very happy with the panelists we do have. It's a strong panel, which I think will bring different perspectives. What I do want to say briefly as well is, why is the University of Pretoria interested in this? And we are starting a program of work in University of Pretoria, and we hope this will be a transdisciplinary program of work that will do research across the disciplines, from the social sciences, from theology to medicine and the natural sciences, to help inform the development, the emergence of what seems to be an emerging legal cannabis industry and sector. So we just believe that there is enormous opportunity in this in all sorts of ways. We know that cannabis has such a wide variety of applications, from the fiber for production of various goods through to recreational use, spiritual use, religious use, and medicinal uses and so on. So there's so much potential socially and economically. There are also serious risks. And we certainly believe that a starting point must be looking at what is the existing production distribution, even if that is considered illegal. Personally, I'm very interested in the fact that there are very many black farmers, small-scale black farmers in rural areas producing cannabis. And in many areas, this is about the only cash crop that makes sense to them. So coming from a land and food perspective, that interests me. And I don't want to see them wiped out. I don't want to see another nail in the coffin of African and black agriculture. So we need to look at what we can build on, what exists already that we can build on for a new industry. And we have to, so there's great opportunities, there are great risks. I think we have to respect also the cultural role of cannabis for many communities. And I'm not only talking about Rastas, this is, there are many communities that use cannabis in different ways. So this is important. It has enormous potential, but I think it also has risks. So the starting point, well, this is the first piece of legislation, so let's engage with it. But certainly I hope this is, well, I'm sure this will be the first of quite many webinars and discussions that we will do and organize as University of Pretoria on this. So next year there will be more, so look out for those if you're interested. For today, I think we have a very exciting panel. We have Suresh Patel, who's stakeholder manager for Fields of Green for All, which is an NGO working in the cannabis space, advocacy space. Let me not say too much about the speakers, each speaker now, but no, the one apology we have is from Myrtle Clark, who's the managing director of Fields of Green. She has played a very central role in developments over the last years that have brought us to this point. I think Suresh will elaborate more. So Myrtle couldn't be with us, but we have her colleague Suresh Patel here, and I think we have a strong panel. Then we have Paul Michael Kiko. Sorry, Michael, I should have checked the pronunciation of your name before, but I'm going to use first names mostly. So Paul Michael from Schindler's Attorneys, Pilasande Tele from Afro-Cannabist, get it right, Mark, from Afro-Cannabist. And we have Dr. Tracy Mwanga from University of Pretoria. So that's going to be our speakers today. We're going to start with Suresh. We're going to go on to Paul Michael, Pilasande, and then Tracy. And then we will open it up also for all of the participants. We're going to give about 10 minutes each. We're going to give a little bit more time to Suresh just now. And yeah, so I will introduce each of them in more details when they're about to start. So first of all, Suresh is a stakeholder manager for Fields of Green for All. You can find them easily if you search online. And he's really interested in connecting with various stakeholders across the cannabis industry. He comes from an entrepreneurial background, having started a number of businesses. And he really believes in the economic opportunity of cannabis, and that lies in creating laws and policies that allows many entrepreneurs, especially among the neediest in our society, to enter into this space. And Fields of Green is definitely one of the more influential NGOs in this space that have done significant work. But he can tell you a bit more about that. So let's welcome Suresh Patel. You can welcome in the chat line as well. Normally, if we were together, I would say a round of applause. As you don't have that, you can show your appreciation by maybe raising your hands and putting them down again so that we can see that you are all awake and here. Also, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat line. We're not going to do a round of intros of all the 54 participants we have online now, but please feel free to start some chats in the chat line. We're going to use that to also ask questions. It's interesting to know where you're all from, so please do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat line as we're speaking. So we get a little bit of sense of that kind of feedback from the participants as well, and that you're all awake. So welcome to all of you. Of course, do please stay muted when you're not speaking, and we will have questions later. With all of that, Suresh, over to you. You're very welcome.
Hey, Mark. Hey, everyone, all the panelists. Thank you for all putting this together, and thank you to all the attendees for attending. Yeah, so my name's Suresh. I am a stakeholder manager for Fields of Green for All, and in a nutshell, I try and build relationships to give Fields of Green a bigger platform to voice our legalization efforts. Mark, I just wanted to check, I see my video has cut off.
We can see you fine.
Perfect.
Yeah, and we're hearing you fine.
Secondly, just want to apologize on behalf of Myrtle. She's actually just traveling today to Malawi. It's just having a bit of technical issues on the comm side, but she definitely wishes to have been here. And I just want to firstly start off by just paying a tribute to Jules Stobbs. He was murdered in early July, and we honestly hope that if he's zooming in from the cosmos, that we do him proud, as well as honor his legacy going forward. So what we are basically going to speak about is our commentary on the cannabis bill. And, Fields of Green for All is a non-profit company, and we are collectively reforming South Africa's cannabis laws together as a community. A large majority of our commentary, as well as our general input for legalization, is based on our cannabis manifesto. And this is a policy document that we've been working on for a number of years, and we're actually in the process of finalizing it for final release, with even new design works, as well as update and content. So essentially, we're going to lead into the commentary, but before we do that, as Mark mentioned, we're going to just briefly speak about how we got to where we are today. And I think it's quite important that in order for us to know where we're going, we need to know where we came from. And a big part of what we speak about in our manifesto is actually about cannabis prohibition, the history of cannabis prohibition in South Africa. I'm just going to briefly run through this. It's not going to be a history lesson, but what happened was in the late 18th century, British colonizers brought Indian slaves to work in the sugar plantations in Natal. And those Indian slaves brought with them cannabis, or bhang, or dakka as it's known, as part of their tradition. And the British colonizers did not like the use of cannabis in any way whatsoever. And so what happened was the seeds of prohibition were planted in the late 18th century. We fast forward to 1924, at the League of Nations, which is the early form of the UN. Whilst they were putting opium under prohibition, South Africa stepped in and suggested that cannabis be added onto this list. So essentially, South Africa had a fundamental role on the war in drugs in general, but more specifically in cannabis. So a very unproudly South African moment. If we kind of fast forward through the decades, I mean, the war on drugs has wasted billions of government's money across the world. People have lost their lives either through incarceration or just losing their lives to this war. And so if we fast forward to 1992, we find that the Drugs and the Drugs Trafficking Act, as well as the Medicines and the Related Substances Control Act in South Africa, are the two main pieces of legislation blocking cannabis legalization. I'm sure Paul Michael will elaborate on this. What we start doing is, as we start edging closer to present day, about 10 years ago, Myrtle and Julian were raided by the police for alleged dealing in cannabis. And instead of paying the bribe, which I had to double check, I think they were asking for like 70,000 Rand or something, they decided to go on the offense because their rights were so violated, and they sued 8 government departments. And so in essence, that's how the Dhaka couple were born. And shortly after that, Fields of Green for All as an organization was formed to take this fight forward. That all basically culminated in what was known as the trial of the plant, which occurred in 2017. And what we used it for was to bring forth experts and evidence to dispel the so-called harms of the plant, and rather focus on the harms of prohibition, which people often don't talk about. Unfortunately, during this trial of the plant, there were a number of delays or delay tactics used by the state, which ultimately led to the trial being put on hold. And a lot of taxpayer money, you and I, our taxpayer money, was wasted in that process. In 2017, at the same time, concurrently, there was a High Court judgment in the Western Cape known as the Davis judgment, essentially where the judge, or the High Court judge, declared that cannabis prohibition is unconstitutionally incorrect. And so our trial of the plant, in addition to that Davis judgment, fast-tracked the 2018 Court ruling on the 18th of September, which based constitutional court ruling, where the judges unanimously said that they decriminalized cannabis growing, possession, and use in a private space, and that private space not limited to a residential dwelling. Unfortunately, the facts of the case at the time didn't speak about dealing, and the judges' hands were tied. And so they didn't make a judgment on dealing or selling cannabis. And so they basically said that government or parliament has 2 years to correct these laws. And so within the 2-year space up until now, that's what's happened. And so, as Mark said, in August 2020, Cabinet passed the Cannabis for Private Purposes Bill, which is still up for public commentary up until the end of this month. And so based on that very brief history lesson, I'm just going to run through our commentary from Fields of Green for All. Just for time's sake, I'm not going to go through everything in detail, but just kind of our high-level observations. So really the first observation that we need to speak about is privacy, because this bill directly contradicts the 2018 Concord ruling that protects our privacy in general. Because essentially, this bill speaks about plant counting as well as limits of how much dried cannabis can be held in your home. So the real question we need to ask ourselves is, who's going to come into our homes to verify how many plants we're growing or how much weed we've got in our cupboard? And so what it boils down to, it seems, from this bill is that the police are heavily involved. And so from our own experience, we know that in order to enter someone's residence or search anyone's private property, you need a search warrant in order to do that. So the question is, are courts going to be granting search warrants in bulk to try and enforce this bill? And what we've seen from our own experience with being in the front lines of Fields of Green is that a lot of cannabis cases are thrown out of court simply because there was never a legitimate search warrant in the first place. Besides that, the technicalities from the police side, etc. But it all boils down to putting a massive burden on our court system, which is already burdened, and wasting a lot of precious tax resources that South Africa doesn't have at the moment. If we're speaking about privacy from a practical point of view, the government makes no mention, and I'm sure Pilasande will elaborate on this as well, is that it doesn't take into account the fact that we've got high density, low income areas and townships in South Africa known as townships. And essentially in a township which is densely populated, you have many people staying within the same household, and even where house owners will rent out their backyards to put up an extra room to rent for residential, even informal business purposes. So if we combine the cannabis bill and the invasion of privacy with the practical fact that we live in a world with townships, is that many of those residents in those properties will be criminals with this bill, unbeknownst to them. So, the government really needs to realize that there's limited privacy for many township residences or residents, and we need to take this into account, because ultimately the poorest are going to be victimized if this bill is implemented. Now, the second observation that I'm going to speak about after privacy is just how, the bill really highlights the harms of prohibition, how it outweighs or far outweighs the perceived harms of the plant. And our manifesto points out that the current laws are based on the perceived harms of cannabis. And the bill creates overly harsh penalties for exceeding plant counts or final dried cannabis amounts. Yet there's no empirical evidence to say where these perceived harms came from. So I'm just going to give a very simple example. The bill says that 2 adults cannot grow more than 8 plants in their household, or have 1.2 kilos of or kilograms of dried cannabis. But now the question is, if you double that, if you have 16 plants, 32 plants, or 5 kilos, where's the evidence that says that that amount is dangerous and therefore it deserves punishment by sending someone to prison? So it really doesn't make sense, and we do bring this up quite a lot in our manifesto document, and we've actually brought evidence in from experts such as Professor David Nutt, a world-renowned drug policy expert who has proven that cannabis is less dangerous than tobacco and alcohol, and therefore these laws don't make sense in that regard. Second thing I'd just like to point out is this minor thing, but I mean, there are harsh penalties for smoking cannabis in public places, which is understandable. However, those penalties should be treated the same as bylaws for alcohol, for public alcohol consumption, as well as public smoking of tobacco. And so they should be treated the same. We don't need to treat cannabis as a different plant. Let's just treat it as the same as alcohol and tobacco. And again, as I mentioned, we've got evidence to show it's less dangerous than the other 2 vices. The third observation, and I think I'll speak a little bit more about this, is just around the police, and it ties into the privacy mentioned previously. This bill clearly defines what's non-compliance and the harsh consequences as a result. And Myrtle had to watch her husband die next to her in a very violent way. There's been zero progress on his case. It's quite embarrassing if I had to tell you what the series of steps that have occurred since Jules's passing. So sometimes I think people might get taken aback with our stance on police, but in reality, if they are not able to catch murderers, not just Jules, but 50 murders a day, but they want to arrest people for plants, it really doesn't make sense. Talking on the police, thanks to the work of Jules, Myrtle, the Fields of Green team, we've got over 100 stay of prosecutions. So what that means is any cannabis offenses that made it to court put aside based on the outcome of the trial of the plant. So essentially, we've got over 100 people walking free because of the work that Fields of Green had laid down. In addition to that, we've also got over 300 documented cases of police overstepping their authority, violating human rights, despite court directives post the 2018 Concord ruling, basically saying leave the stoners alone. So we've found in general, based on this, is that there's a big disconnect between the police on the ground and upper police management, with a lack of the correct information flowing from top to bottom to everyday police. We're finding most cannabis-related arrests are being thrown out of court due to technicalities. So it's wasting police time, their resources, court resources, our resources. And so what we feel is that the police need to really build capacity in understanding this plant as well as the developments in the law, because there's a very clear disconnect in that. Or else what will happen is that the civil claims will keep mounting against the police, and ultimately the ones who end up paying for that are the taxpayers. So we were literally wasting money on an issue that shouldn't be there in the first place. Just something I want to elaborate on, just on the police. Very recently, Tito Mboweni, our finance minister, said that in order to prop up our South African Airway SOE airline, with over 10 billion rand. They needed to find the money somewhere, and they cut the budget departments across many government departments, police being one of them. Over 1 billion rand is going to be taken out of the police budget to prop up an airline, which is crazy. And we find that operationally, the police will not be able to enforce this bill or this proposed bill with the limited resources they have now and more limited in the very near future. And we also feel that it will create an environment that's very conducive for bribery. I mean, if police are not being paid what they're supposed to be being paid, it facilitates bribery and corruption. And we really need to stop that from the system, from the root or the baseline. And finally, the fourth observation is around plant botany and Cannabis 101. And this is actually, besides updating our manifesto, we're adding an entirely new chapter where we find that from beginning to end of this bill, it shows a total lack of understanding of cannabis as a plant, as well as how it's consumed, because the bill strictly speaks about cannabis being smoked. Meanwhile, we know that there are other ways to ingest cannabis, whether it's through edibles, through vaporizing, etc. So we're busy with this in our manifesto, and we feel it's a very simple stepping stone that should be understood first before we create laws about this plant. So
Great.
Finally, that's our comments on the bill, and obviously it's easy to criticize, it's harder to give recommendations, but I think with all the negative observations, the first thing we might have to commend is the fact that government have mentioned expungements of criminal records in this bill.
You've run out of time. Can I ask you to wrap up?
Yeah, 100%. It's great that expungements have been mentioned in the bill, and we really feel that the bill totally missed the mark on commercialization, and we speak about that more in our manifesto around cannabis hubs as well as DACA private clubs. And the final thing, just before I end off, is we are pushing for the formation of a cannabis ombudsman, which is essentially an independent cannabis regulatory body that's going to act as a middleman between government and cannabis industry, voicing any grievances from the industry and creating a dialogue platform. And finally, we'd just like to thank everyone for giving us this opportunity to voice our views. And we really think government needs to focus on cannabis, especially amongst or post this COVID-19 pandemic, which has decimated the economy. And we really need to unleash this plant in its entirety and not just focus on hemp and CBD and look at it as a whole. Thank you, Mark, and that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Suresh. Thanks for the input. Great, and thanks for those who are also sharing and commenting in the chat line. I think the other panelists will realize when they see my face reappearing and my mic being unmuted, then time is up. So I'll go to Paul Michael. He's a partner at Schindler Attorneys, specializes in commercial and general litigation, and he assisted and helped represent the so-called DACA couple, that's Myrtle and Jules, through their Pretoria trial and all the way to the Constitutional Court case that Suresh just referred to. He now heads up Schindler's medicinal and recreational cannabis law department. So, Paul Michael, you're very welcome as one of the leading legal minds and on this topic. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Mark. Just kicking off from where Suresh left off, I mean, obviously it is indeed a lot easier to criticize than it is to give constructive feedback on something as to what should be done. But, you know, just having walked this journey, there's some important things to observe here, and that this bill is drafted by Department of Justice. That seems to be common cause. And it was Department of Justice who was really leading the defense of the constitutional challenges. These are the people who were fighting us in court tooth and nail to hold on to prohibition. So I don't know the individuals behind the bill, but certainly we know that it was a dirty fight in court and that ultimately the Constitutional Court described the state's evidence to support prohibition as singularly unimpressive. So what we would really hope is that we're not faced with a situation where the Department of Justice is trying to claw back on what they have already lost in the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court has already found that certainly the right to privacy of individuals is infringed when you prohibit them from making life decisions as to what they put into their body, as to what they grow in their backyard, who they share the produce of their backyard with, etc., etc. So I am a little bit anxious because it does seem to be that although Parliament was mandated to come back with reactive legislation, that perhaps this is a fight in and of itself. And we certainly don't want to see that. And also from what Suresh was saying, I mean, yes, there are going to be certain established harms, scientifically established harms associated with cannabis and cannabis use. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be the foundation upon which the bill is built, but nonetheless, they do exist. And we don't want to be dishonest by pretending that cannabis and cannabis use is harmless in all instances. But there are some philosophical and legal questions that come along with this. And that's that, well, do we prohibit, and for that matter, criminally prohibit something just because it is bad for somebody? And as a matter of policy, we don't prohibit beer. We don't prohibit the use or consumption of beer and other alcoholic beverages, nor do we do so with tobacco. We don't go into people's houses to determine whether they have a cellar full of beer that is in an amount that allows the state to infer that that person might be doing themselves harm. What do we do with that person? We say, all right, well, that person seems to be suffering from an alcoholism problem. Let's help them. But we don't put that person into prison or criminally charge them or otherwise ruin their lives for the consequences of their alcohol use, unless, of course, it is so that that person has gone on to harm a third party, i.e. infringe the rights of a third party. So these are the philosophical points that we come from. There is recognized in our law something that's called volenti non fit inuria, to unpack the Latin, that is voluntary assumption of risk. We allow somebody to get into a boxing ring and potentially get knocked unconscious. We allow them to go skydiving. We allow them to drink themselves into a stupor at a 21st birthday party or at a bachelor party. These are things that we allow without criminal consequences. So why is it that we want to treat cannabis differently to that? And I think that that is an answer that ought to be coming from Parliament when it is formulating legislation that is going to restrict our rights. And this is why it's also such a pity that the committee that is responsible for the drafting did not get involved at this stage. In fact, prior to even putting pen to paper, participatory governance would have expected of them that they would have approached the Rastas and they would have approached the small-scale farmers in the rural Eastern Cape and approached big business and approached the casual dacha users. But we know for a fact that these people were not approached and that this legislation was put together by people who do not understand cannabis and cannabis use. And this is why it is so easy to criticize, because the criticism, or rather the suggestions, are coming as a reaction to what is fundamentally a bad piece of legislation. Why do I say that it's a bad piece of legislation? Well, as well-intentioned as it might have been, we are not respecting foundational constitutional human rights. I mean, for example, Section 1 of the Constitution says that the Republic of South Africa is one sovereign democratic state founded on the following values. And then it says human dignity, the achievement of equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms. Now, how is it that we are advancing the freedoms of people when we are telling them that they are not free to consume or grow more than a certain amount of cannabis in the privacy of their own homes? Of course, we talk about Section 2 of the Constitution. It's the supreme law of the Republic, and all law or conduct inconsistent with it is invalid. So we can't be falling back on things like international obligations to somehow justify what is otherwise a bad and unconstitutional law. The other thing that's quite interesting about this is Suresh has already spoken about talking in terms of harm reductions. You view this through the prism of Section 36 of our Constitution, which is to say that there's a certain framework that one is supposed to look at any rights limitation through. You're supposed to look at the nature of the right, the importance and purpose of the limitation, the nature and extent of the limitation, the relation between the limitation and its purpose, and less restrictive means to achieve the same purpose. So if there are harms associated with cannabis, the Constitution itself mandates you to be very mindful of, in trying to prevent those harms, not inadvertently doing more harms than you are trying to prevent, because then not only is your law unconstitutional, but your application of the law is unconstitutional. Because why? You are alleging that there are harms associated with cannabis, but then in trying to prevent those harms, you are arresting somebody, you are dragging them through a criminal trial. Ultimately, you are possibly putting them in prison, exposing them to harder drugs, exposing them to harder criminals. You are depriving breadwinners, you're depriving families of their breadwinners. The long and the short of it is that enforcing criminal prohibition is ruining lives, and it is ruining lives where there is no evidence to suggest that cannabis use per se is ruining lives, or certainly not to the same extent. And that's where you're being irrational and arbitrary in your lawmaking and in the application of those laws. Apart from that, it seems like, you know, if you treat the state as this large confused octopus, as it were, certain of the tentacles have absolutely no idea what the other tentacles are doing, because we have already the state's National Drug Master Plan, the 4th edition, which is of application from 2019 to 2024. And this is an acknowledgement of the fact that there are ways to combat the perceived or established harms of drug use without doing more harm. And we talk about harm reduction philosophies, reducing social, economic, and health consequences, evidence-based public health principles to support people, not punish people, but support people who use drugs. And ultimately, what that National Drug Master Plan, which has been mandated by the very same government, which has now put into place the bill, it says that we ought to be taking drug use or drug abuse out of the hands of the Department of Justice and the criminal justice system and treating it as a health problem, putting it into the hands of empathetic healers and doctors and hospitals and all of the people who actually want to help drug users. So how it is that we can have the National Drug Master Plan published, which calls for all of these strategies, and then have a bill which purports to put people into prison for having more than a certain number of cannabis plants in their backyard, just completely demonstrates to us that we are completely not having one tentacle speaking to the other tentacle. I do see that I'm running short on time at this stage, but generally speaking, what we're going to say is that it's not only the right to privacy that is infringed by any sort of criminal prohibition centered around cannabis use. There are various other rights in the Constitution: the right to equality, the right to dignity, the right to life. Certain people lose their lives in prison. Freedom and security of the person. You can put into your body what you choose to do, as long as you appreciate the consequences that might befall you. The right to privacy, religion, belief and opinion, freedom of expression, freedom of trade and occupation, environment, property, and healthcare. Ultimately, what should Parliament be doing here? They haven't done it, but what should they be doing? They should be speaking to cannabis users. They should be looking at the scientifically established harms that might legitimately seek to be prevented. And through this, the prism of Section 36 of the Constitution, leaning on the National Drug Master Plan, for example, they ought to be a balancing exercise to make sure that you're not doing more harm than you're seeking to prevent. You should be looking at less restrictive means that can be employed to achieve whatever the legitimate ends are of harm reductions. We should be certainly boosting economic opportunity that is presented by a well-regulated cannabis industry. Why is it that an Eastern Cape farmer can't grow a field of hemp? What harms are you preventing by keeping him scratching around in the dirt with things like maize? And fundamentally, we should be looking to promote the freedoms that are established in terms of the Bill of Rights, the foundational principle of freedom of individuals enshrined in Section 1 of the Constitution. That's what we should be doing. And we should be having an open dialogue with Parliament, not refusing to come onto these sorts of talks because we want to first go through the parliamentary process and only then hold ourselves accountable to the people who voted us in. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks very much, Paul Michael. Thanks a lot. for your input. Sorry, time is short, but I do want to also say to everyone on the webinar that the intention is to go until 1:30. So the speakers will be finished before 1, and we'll still have time for more interaction. Also note that there's the Q&A function where you can post questions, and we'll try and make sure we get to all of those questions. And as well as you feel free to carry on commenting in the chat line. I'll also ask the panelists, to take a look at the chat line, take a look at the questions and answers, and you can also answer some of them there as well as answering them verbally later on. So maybe you can deal with some of those as well. So now we go on to Pila Sande. He's a dynamic young man. You won't see his face today because he says his camera is not working. And in fact, he proved it wasn't working. So he's not just hiding himself. He doesn't look terrible. It's just that his camera is not working. So please forgive him for that. And I hope he makes up for the lack of the visuals with a sort of dynamic input. He's not only in the cannabis space, but he's well known for his work in agriculture and food. He's got a famous chili of Soweto that he developed, and it's been internationally recognized by the Arc of Taste catalog that's linked to the slow food movement. He is a founder of Siyazanzela Plant Biotech and agricultural consultants. And he was a co-founder of Izindaba Zokudla, which is a farmers platform mainly focused on farmers, small farmers around Soweto. And then he's become also the director of propagation, cultivation, and processing at Cannabis Pty Limited. So big welcome to Pila Sande. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for everyone attending. Welcome. You asked whether this was a nice first step. Yes, it's a first step, but personally, and as also at Cannabis, we don't think it was a good first step, because as Paul and Suresh have said, the bill actually does not help our people. Instead, it does not make the situation better, especially when it comes to the sanctions and the charges that people have to go through, looking at 15 years, 6 years, 4 years, just for possession and usage. So no, we are not happy. There are two overriding themes that we have submitted our own contribution with CALS, as Mark, you may know. And so I will take some of my comments from there based on what we have found that we are not very happy about, and some of the matters that other speakers did not touch on. So first of all, maybe Paul will be able to help us with this because he understands the law better and he has been working with this bill and the constitutional judgment on it, about where do we stand right now. Actually, the law has not been passed. The government is talking as if nothing will be done up until next year. So what are our people supposed to be doing right now when it comes to this bill? And when it comes to cannabis usage, propagation, selling amongst themselves. And so, yeah, that's one of our issue, is understanding where we stand right now. And then again, we find that the bill itself tends to infringe on the right to self-determination, and this rises throughout the bill. That's why we have prescribed quantities. Why are you determining quantities? The bill itself on the second page talks about regulating the consumption of cannabis by an adult person. Why does the bill want to regulate consumption of cannabis by an adult when they don't regulate consumption of Coca-Cola, for example? So we feel that the bill tends to be very much against the right to self-determination, and the harm of the prescribed conditions by the bill is actually not explained throughout the bill, and we personally don't understand it, even to go to an extent of whereby one is allowed to give another adult person, whether it be cannabis seeds, whether it be cannabis or whatever cannabis product, but you are not allowed to sell. What is the harm if you are allowed to give one person, and if you are doing it the same thing for remuneration? Where is the harm in that if it's the same person that you are giving to, and it's the same two adults that are legal to do that? So it's those things that we have a problem with. And then we feel that the language of the bill is too legalistic. It ignores the plain language movement, which proposes the use of language which can be understood by those individuals bound by the law. Instead of using legalese, which is highly technical and largely inaccessible to normal South Africans, the bill should use common colloquial language. And that's an issue that we don't see in the bill. So we also feel that the fact that the sale and trade is not discussed in the bill right now, especially promotes the black market, and we see it as a hindrance to economic participation of black people. And one of the things that our country should be doing right now, with the economy so bad, and one of the post-COVID economic platforms, is to be allowing our people to grow cannabis, be able to sell cannabis amongst each other. And now when you try and propose a bill, when you know that there has been about 900,000 farmers who are growing cannabis, and you are saying, no, don't grow cannabis. If we find you with 15 plants, we are going to send you for 15 years in jail. Like, how does our government do that? How are our people supposed to practice mass growing and practice participating in the economy, whether it's the township economy or the formal economy, whichever economy? How do you practice? How do you participate if you have not been allowed to practice, or even been given a platform where you are capacitated to be able to participate in the upcoming economy? So we feel that this bill has a direct attack on black people. There's a criminalization of poverty. There's a direct attack on women, even children, because it is well known in this country that there are people, there are households with child-headed families. So the children may not be even using cannabis for their own consumption, but they could be growing it so that they can be able to survive and fend for themselves, since they cannot go to work and they still have to go to school. But if you can grow a plant and sell it to sustain yourself, why does that seem to be a crime? Why isn't there a way of coming up with a method of regulating that right now and being able to let our people grow cannabis? We feel it's also a direct attack on women, because it has been known that cannabis in our rural villages has been mostly been grown by women to support their families. So now when you put it as blatantly as this, and you say we are going to charge you 15 years for selling any amount, for possessing any amount above the prescribed quantity, how many women is this bill trying to attack and put to prison? Like, how much more is it trying to devastate our economy? So those are our main issues. And then the last one, which I think I'm on 8 minutes.
Track. Yeah, 1 minute to wrap up.
Okay, 1 minute to wrap up.
Great.
The last point is just one that is totally ignored, which is, well, what about consumption of cannabis by hospital patients and prisoners? Our country is known to have one of the highest HIV, AIDS, and cancer patients in the world. But the bill does not talk about whether these people could be allowed to use cannabis in hospitals or in prisons, and yet cigarettes are allowed in these places. So I think I should end there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Ilasande. And I've been tempted to say great input after all the speakers so far, but I didn't want to appear biased. So, but so far, thanks to all the great inputs. And we'll go over, so no pressure now for our last speaker, as we go on to Dr. Tracy Mwanga. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pretoria in a sort of perfect combination for this subject of law and the natural and agricultural sciences. And she completed her doctorate in public law at UP in 2018, focusing on international human rights and medical law. And she also lectures and supervises legal students, and worked on the submission that also some of us at University of Pretoria have made to Parliament. So you're very welcome, Tracy.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you everybody for being here. So I'm just going to speak a bit about some of the things that I feel the bill doesn't take into account, and I'll try to be as brief as possible so that I can be in keeping with the time. So first, I think I just want to mention that the bill does have some positive aspects. It's good that it looks into the expungement of prior criminal records, and that it does also allow for the use and possession and cultivation of cannabis, even though it's quite limited, for your recreational and medicinal purposes. But a further examination of the bill shows that it's actually quite narrow. So the two main points that I want to bring forward is that, firstly, the bill doesn't actually set a tone or a path for the development of this cannabis sector in the country, because this could maximize many opportunities while regulating the risks that are involved, some of which have been discussed already. And secondly, it doesn't make enough provision for research that's going to be important for the development of this section. So those are the two main points that I'm going to be speaking on today. So earlier this year, the president did address the nation in February regarding the legal cannabis sector, and he did mention the inclusion of opportunities for small-scale farmers, as well as the regulation of hemp products commercially. So yes, we can't expect every piece of legislation to address all of the aspects, but it could be argued that this bill is or should be seen as a first step, and others that are going to follow will also address the wider potential for this sector. Now, the bill is quite narrow, and I think part of the reason was already put forward by, I think it was Paul Michael, who mentioned that it's only being considered by the Portfolio Committee on Justice and Correctional Services. So that can, in effect, create more of a punitive bill. And I think that that's part of the reason why it's focusing more on penalties than other aspects. But I'll speak a bit more on that as well. So the first, one of the more obvious things that came forward to me when looking at the bill was that it doesn't cater for commercial aspects. So in terms of this bill, you can possess cannabis, you can cultivate it, you can within the legal framework that they provide. But if you purchase it, then you're committing a crime. So the problem with that is that it creates two problems. First, it's ignoring the fact that there already is a market for cannabis. Though it is illegal, it is there. So it would be better to rather regulate that sector and allow for people to be able to purchase cannabis. Because if you can't purchase it, then that means you have to inevitably go the illegal route in order to get cannabis. So it doesn't quite make sense in that way. The second problem with not having a commercial outlet is that it's neglecting the potential economic opportunities. And I think that Suresh spoke on this a little bit. because yeah, it's neglecting those potential economic opportunities that would include the potential for new revenue generation. I mean, this would be beneficial for the state, as we've already seen that the impact that COVID-19 has had, not only on the South African economy, but globally as well. So I feel like that is an aspect that was not taken into account. Speaking on the penalties, I do see, like I mentioned before, there's more penalties than other aspects which are important as well and should be considered, because the whole point of this is to try to create a wider developmental strategy for the sector. So if you're only focusing on penalties, then people are going to, then it's going to be very restrictive. So I just want to highlight a few of the penalties that I saw in the bill because of time constraints. But in terms of possessing cannabis plants, if you possess 6 cannabis plants, then that's considered to be a trafficable offense and you can get 6 years in prison. If you possess 9 cannabis plants, that's considered to be a commercial offense and you can get 15 years in prison. So for starters, the amount of the quantity we feel is a bit too low. 6 plants shouldn't necessarily amount to a trafficable offense and 9 plants shouldn't be considered to be a commercial offense. We feel like the numbers are, first of all, too low. We also feel like as though the difference between the quantities don't make sense in relation to the sentences. So from 6 plants, you get 6 years, and from 9 plants, you get 15 years. It's a big jump, which we feel is unfair in that way. And 15 years on its own is also quite harsh. And I think that Philisande spoke on that as well. For you to be in possession of 9 plants and get 15 years in prison, just to make a small comparison in criminal law, if you are charged with, if you're charged and convicted with murder that wasn't premeditated, you can get up to 15 years in prison. So we don't see the relation how you can say that possessing 9 plants can be compared to taking somebody else's life. So just to say that that is also a little bit unfair. Then there's also the instance of being able to carry flowering plants. In terms of the bill, you can give a flowering plant as a gift to a person, but you're only allowed to do so if you're only giving 1 plant as a present. So we feel like that number is also a bit too low, because if you're caught now with 2 flowering plants, then that's a trafficable offense and you can get 6 years. So we feel like it's a bit too restrictive in that way and a bit unfair in terms of the sentencing. The other problems that we noticed with the bill is also to being able to possess these plants in a public space. So the bill allows for you to only carry 1 flowering plant, but we feel that the number is too low because it translates to you only being able to carry 1 plant at a time, to transport it once at a time. And that's going to be restrictive on individuals in rural areas where the production of these plants might be a greater distance from where the people themselves live. So the bill didn't take that into account either. But aside from the punitive measures being problematic, even in the absence of a broader strategy that would be ideal, we feel that the bill must at least address trade to some extent as well. So it is an inevitable part of cannabis use. And there are already what's known as Dacha private clubs that are existing, which is not a full commercialization of cannabis, but it's a way for individuals to collectively grow, share, and consume cannabis in a private controlled environment. So we feel like the bill should also take that into account and to make provision for it as well. Because it would also allow for a better regulation of that trade, which is already in existence. I wanted to also bring up the aspect of discrimination, because certain aspects of the bill could potentially lead to discrimination. I'm only going to highlight 3 different aspects that I found in the bill. The first one is that it only allows for cultivation of a maximum allowance that is equivalent to 2 adults per household. So this already discriminates against larger families that are often found, particularly in rural areas. So the bill needs to consider all adults that are residing in that particular household in order to determine the amount that's allowed for cultivation. The second problem that I found, which could potentially lead to discrimination, is the fact that cannabis has been used, and I think one of the previous speakers mentioned this, but cannabis has been used for cultural and religious purposes, and some of them have long traditional and historic roots. These particular practices usually occur in public spaces for one, and secondly, it involves usually the gathering of more than 2 adults. So these particular events are not catered for in the bill, and it's going to ultimately result in discrimination of certain religious and cultural groups as well. And then lastly, with regard to discrimination, just to point out the fact that individuals who have little or no access to private land will be prevented from using communal land to cultivate the cannabis plants. So the reason why they can't use that is because it would go against the definition provided for in the bill for what would be considered a private space. So you're going to ultimately be discriminating against more likely the poorer people and people within the rural areas who don't have access to private property. So I would also just like to, because I think that I might be running a bit short on time, I just wanted to return to my main point where I was discussing how the bill actually doesn't make provision for scientific and academic research relating to the use of cannabis. There are opportunities available for medical research. So if you want to look at cannabis for medicinal purposes, those measures are available, although the procedure is quite difficult. It's quite an onerous procedure. So that already in itself is a bit restrictive, but we would have hoped to see the bill to include provision for more of a scientific and academic research being undergone by your higher education and research institutions. Now, we feel that it's essential for these institutions to be involved because we're looking at the development of a wider strategy for legal cannabis moving forward, hopefully. So that should include different sectors and different aspects as well. So we're suggesting that explicit provision should be made for the production, processing, and storage of cannabis plants and products for nonprofit research to be undergone by these higher education and research institutions. Doing this would also be in line with several of the United Nations conventions that South Africa is a party to. So we feel that it would be important to take this into account as well. Yeah, so, but in conclusion, I'd just like to say that the bill is quite narrow and it focuses a bit too much on the penalties, which is very restrictive. It can be discriminatory toward most people from the rural areas. And yeah, I can see I'm out of time now. So I just wanted to say thank you, Mark, for putting this together. And thank you to all the other panelists who have spoken.
Great, thanks very much, Tracy, for that. And you stuck well to time. Thank you for that. Thanks to all the speakers. I think great inputs. I did say, yeah, you can clap in the chat line because you can't clap in a way they were here. Unless we put, yeah, I can't even switch you all on. So you can't clap in that way, but you can note your appreciation in the chat line. So yeah, thanks very much. I think we've got some great inputs, but I want to go straight over to the attendees who are with us, and we appreciate you being with us, and check the questions. There are a number of questions in the question spot. So some of them directed to specific people, and some of them have been answered. So thanks for that. But we can also, if you've got other questions, you can also raise your hands. We can take a couple of people giving their questions verbally. If you do that, please just keep them short and to the point. So, from the questions, were there any questions that any of the panelists would like to answer at more length in verbally? I see that Paul Michael has been answering quite a bit in the question answer, which is appreciated. But any of the panel points that anyone would like to answer at more length? If I made myself clear. So I'm saying to any of the panelists, if there's questions you want to answer, you can go for them. Otherwise, I'm going to direct you to some of the questions. I think there's a broad issue for me that definitely the bill is, all of you pointed to the narrowness of the bill. So I'm kind of wondering, should we be calling for the bill to be rejected completely in its current form, or can it be redeemed? What's the way forward? I think it's one of the issues, even tactically, if people want to engage in it. Do we, you've all kind of combined pointing to very broad problems with the bill, as well as pointing to some of the narrower technical problems, which I think is great. But should we be just calling for it to be scrapped and we start again, or should we be building on the current one as it stands? Any of the panelists on that? Yeah, maybe panelists, at least could you, if you have working cameras, put your cameras on so we can all see all of the panel now as well.
If I may,
Yeah.
and I'm sure the other panelists are going to have different perspectives on this, but the problem is that we know that what ought to have gone into the bill didn't go into the bill, and that was research around what cannabis is, what it isn't, the harms that it does, the harms that it doesn't, and with the very people whose rights are affected by this legislation. So it's very difficult to try to take something that is the product that is built on completely shaky foundations and then try to panel beat that. I think the better way is to acknowledge that this process went horribly wrong, to then speak to the people affected, the scientists, the doctors, the criminologists, all of them, and redo it, get it right. That's my perspective.
Right. Start from scratch. What do other panelists feel?
I think that I agree. I think that they actually need to start from scratch because it's not as inclusive as it should be. Like Paul Marco said, they're not taking into account the views of people from the rural areas, and the fact that it's only the Department of Justice that seems to be formulating this particular bill. That's also problematic because we need to be looking at the inclusion of other sectors like the Department of Health and Education and so on and so forth. So I think that they should actually just start from scratch.
Okay, thanks. Suresh?
Yeah, I'll build on that. I mean, there's no foundation to build on from this bill. And then just also something maybe directed towards Pilasande, something based on growers in the rural areas. You know, I think I read something in the UP commentary about it. You know, it's known that indigenous cannabis growers in those areas, they will grow cannabis on communal land next to, say, the banks of a river. And so maybe Paul Michael can answer or give input, but I mean, how is that taken into account if no one owns the land, therefore there's no real privacy boundaries in such a way? But just just something to point out.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll come through.
Yeah.
Yes, no, we have an issue with that. We don't understand it either. We raised it in our comment to Parliament about the communal land. But Paul and all other panelists, what do we do right now? Where do we stand? Because honestly, our people, for us, it's just our people need to farm, our people need to start getting this money in to be allowed to sell to themselves. What do we do right now? Where do we stand?
Right. Okay, maybe by the end of this we can come to a call for action. I'm hearing a sort of the desire for some call to action. Fine, but let's also unpack it a little bit more. And I think there's a question from Fraser McNeil asking to what extent the bill is paving the way for big business to grow and sell by making it complex and dangerous to grow, etc. Is this an inevitable next step? And if so, what does it say to the idea that the bill is clawing back prohibition from the Concord ruling? That's a question from Fraser. So I wonder if you want to respond to it. It relates to sort of, well, what's the vision for this sector in the future? You know, and we might be seeing this bill as completely lacking vision, but perhaps there's a hidden vision behind it that we're not aware of. I'm not sure if anyone's got a thought on that.
I can go on.
I'll give you, yeah, okay. Please go for it.
And then we'll come to Paul Michael.
Okay. No, with the people we have discussed our submission with, we just felt that the agenda has been already been discussed with business, because already the model is out there for medicinal cannabis. So big business can participate in that, but no, the normal person cannot, because they can't administer medicine in whatever form, especially if it's cannabis.
Okay, thanks. So there's already some deals going on with big business. Suresh, and then
yeah. So I had a conversation with one of our team members not too long ago, and he'd actually said that he was consulting on a project where I think this corporation had invested, I think, about 100 million rand, and not a seed has been planted in the ground. So, we don't hear about these things in the news, but perhaps there is maybe a hidden force driving it that we're not seeing.
Yeah. Anyone else? Maybe I can also say from my side, we know of large farmers who are already getting licenses to export. And the concern for me from a sort of development point of view is that that puts us back in this typical African trap where we're exporting unprocessed raw materials, obviously at a lower price, and already we're importing CBD oils and so on. So already it's happening. There are farmers. I've heard of white South African farmers in Zambia also exporting to Canada and so on. So this is already happening. Paul Michael?
The Concord judgment is the culmination of many years of having had to sue government on issues that all could have been avoided if they had actually just listened to their people, to its people. And that's what's so frustrating, is that the Constitutional Court says, all right, well, we find on the basis of privacy, and these are the minimum number of freedoms that you must now afford to cannabis users in South Africa, but they didn't put a limit on that. The Constitutional Court didn't say that this is as far as Parliament's allowed to go. So again, a more philosophical or a more general policy-based question, and it would have been nice if the steering committee was here to answer it, but why are we being so short-sighted? Why are we only legislating in reaction to the judgment? I mean, when you've got Tito Mboweni who's saying, oh, we're going to make all of the rural farmers rich and uplift them out of poverty, and President Cyril Ramaphosa is saying that, yeah, we're going to look at cannabis to pave the way. Again, we've got this monster octopus that its tentacles just aren't talking to one another. Why do we not have these insights from government, and why are we so fixated on the old way of doing things when this presents such a massive opportunity? I mean, you asked the question around what do we do about communal land and how do we plug in the privacy right? I would answer that with another question. Why are we so fixated on the right to privacy just because it was what the Constitutional Court hung its hat on? Parliament can go far beyond what the Constitutional Court did, and it really ought to be doing so.
Okay, I see Pilasande's hand went up quickly there. Respond on this one as well after Pilasande, maybe. No? Okay, Pilasande.
Okay. No, I'm just not even trying to go against what Paul is saying. I'm just supporting. And what hurts more is that when you look at the bill states that there is no, when you look at the definition of hemp, it states that there is no THC in hemp, but it says hemp is cultivated under the authority of a law that regulates its cultivation. Why is hemp even being regulated, the cultivation of hemp being regulated, if it has no THC, therefore more CBD, therefore has a much more medicinal property than a psychotic property? Why is that being regulated from our people? Why aren't our people allowed to grow? Because according to this bill, then we're not allowed to grow hemp.
Okay. I don't know if you wanted to add, Tracy. Otherwise, I also want to come to a question from Mariki. Mariki, I think she's saying that according to what we're hearing from all of the speakers, you're basically saying there's agreement that this is problematic and narrow legislation. It doesn't do justice to the potential of the sector. It just seems to be a very minimalist, punitive response to a court order, which is totally different from the kind of message we heard in the State of the Nation address from the president, as Tracy mentioned. So Mariki goes on to say then, but how should we formulate and approach the emerging cannabis industry in a way that accommodates the various social uses and meanings cannabis holds for people without disadvantage? So if we're saying this bill really isn't good enough, where should we start? We've heard a few ideas from you, but maybe we can build on that. I mean, certainly I've heard clearly said we must build on the research, build on the science, and Tracy said we must create also the legal space for that research. You're starting an industry here, but you're not creating any space for research that could monitor the impacts of that industry or inform that industry. So we've heard some of that, but what else would we want to suggest And again, attendees are welcome to add their suggestions as well. Where should we start then? Let's say this bill is not there. Where should we be starting in shaping this? Paul Michael, I see you raising your hand on the camera eagerly. Please kick off. Maybe I'll ask for all the panelists to chip in on that as well.
Yeah, if I may, I think that's exactly it, is that by making this too complicated and on the basis of a misunderstanding of cannabis, you are going to prevent a lot of people from uplifting themselves with it. So why not look at a model that, instead of regulating the plant itself or the cultivation of the plant, actually regulates the legitimate and the illegitimate uses to which the plant can be put? Because if somebody is growing a huge field of hemp and it's never going to be used to get underage people stoned, then you have no business telling that person that they can't grow that hemp. But if, on the other hand, that was the intention behind it, and you as the criminal justice system can come in and say, hold on, you were actually dealing cannabis to children, well, then that is legitimate regulation. You are legitimate then in putting that person into prison. So that's really how they should be looking at it, is what is legitimate and what is illegitimate, and let's regulate that, instead of this umbrella idea that we need to limit the number of plants that an individual is allowed to grow without being sent to prison. I would say that's a good place to start.
Regulate the end use and leave production. Yeah, Suresh.
Yeah, I'll just build on that. I think something maybe none of us have mentioned so far is the fact that there's already a black market. There's an illicit, thriving cannabis market in South Africa. People are growing a lot of cannabis. People are importing seeds. There's grow shops popping up all over the place. And I think if we especially look at the lockdown and those whatever level regulations where they banned tobacco and alcohol, it didn't stop people either consuming it or purchasing it. So I think no matter what laws probably get put into place, and even if they are as restrictive as possible, people aren't going to stop doing what they're doing. But what that basically boils down to is that black market illicit money never makes it into the legitimate system. It kind of does, because people will spend, and we all pay that the moment we buy something. But it's already a system that's losing money. And so even if the wrong laws are implemented, people are still going to grow and sell their cannabis, just more underground. Thank you.
And I see in the chat line that Charla said we have an estimated 300,000 cannabis farmers in South Africa. So there's an existing informal industry that should simply be allowed to function and be taxed, not arrested. So I think that's echoing Suresh's point as well. Tracy?
I just wanted to say that I think that to start, participation is key. You need to speak to the different people that these particular laws are going to affect. So if you're saying that you want to help the informal or small scale farmers, then speak to the small scale farmers. If you're going to say that you want to allow it for medicinal purposes, then involve the Department of Health in those discussions. If it's only sitting at the Department of Justice, I'm failing to understand how they were able to come out with a bill without speaking to the people first, or even just speaking to people in informal settlements to see what their needs are, how their living situations are, just so that they can get an idea of how to formulate this legislation better. So yeah, I'm just having trouble understanding how they were able to come out with this bill without actually speaking to the different sectors.
And it's sitting with Justice and Correctional Services. Which portfolio committees should be involved? Because there's a challenge in this process that even if you open a wider discussion, if it's only with that committee, I'm sure they have particular interests. Which committees do you think should be involved?
Well, I mean, committees involved in agriculture would make sense since we're looking at the cultivation of cannabis. So that would make sense to me. Committees involved in healthcare as well would make sense to me since we're looking at it for medicinal purposes. Economic as well, since we're looking at commercially regulating cannabis, which is actually another thing, because the president did state in his address that he wants to open up the market for the commercial use of hemp products, but the bill itself mentions nothing to do with any commercial outlets. So yeah, but I think that those are the committees that should be involved, okay, or some of.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, that which would imply a much wider process with a different set of interests and objectives. I'm just also checking the chat line. I see Comrade Dale is saying that on the issue of the bill not speaking to associated economic opportunities for small-scale cooperative growers and distributors, does this omission not open the space even further for insider corrupt state corporate deals and longer-term criminalization and marginalization of small-scale cooperative growers and distributors? If anyone wants to respond to that, you're welcome to. And I see Fakila is saying cannabis is medicine. That would obviously imply talking to medicinal people and those who use it for medicinal purposes as well. If I can, as the chair, I just want to share one little experience that I was with some family friends in Mamelodi earlier this year, and the 75-year-old woman that we were visiting, who's a staunch churchgoer, and would never see herself breaking the law, had cannabis plants in her kitchen. And when we asked what it was for, she was making something, a remedy that she saw her mother make in the past. And she'd got the cannabis from her neighbor just on the other side of the road who had a few plants in the front yard. So to me, it was just a different picture of what we mean and what the court orders meant. She would never have done this before the Constitutional Court ruling, but she had heard that now this is acceptable. And she remembered what her mother used to do, and her neighbor now gave to her freely and said, no, share. So that's another side of cannabis that I don't think we often kind of see. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that when I saw Fakile saying cannabis is medicine. And yet we don't even make space for that because the cannabis was already violating this law because you could see the plants, and she had them openly in the kitchen and there were children around, so she'd be in true violation and could be locked up for years in terms of this law. And I see Bronwyn saying that Big Pharma have been instrumental in the limitations on the bill. It would be interesting to unpack that if we can unpack who really has been influencing it. And I won't go through more comments now, maybe back to the panelists. I think, Pilasande, your hand is up.
Yes. Finally, you talk about your experience right now, because number one, as Africans, we understand cannabis to be used for chest ailments, just like we've been seeing the use of artemisia right now during COVID. So we find that strange because now, according to this bill, that's 15 years because you are an adult and you're administering cannabis to a child, which is cannabis consumption. And that's already just out of the question. So where do we start? Number one, I would like to comment on the fact that, yes, the other panelists and the other comments that are coming up are correct in saying we are not starting an industry. The industry has already been there. Here we're quoting 300,000 farmers, 900,000 farmers have been quoted elsewhere. So we're not starting a new industry. It's like the government going to the taxi industry and saying, we're starting a new industry with the taxi industry. No, you're trying to formalize the taxi industry, regulate it so that your people can get paid in it, or whatever corruption you want going on can start going on. You find yourself a way to benefit from it. That's exactly how we feel about the cannabis industry. So no, this is not an industry. Where do we start? I would say like spinach. Let people who want to grow spinach, who can grow spinach, who can sell spinach, do so. And of course, there should be child regulation when it comes to child usage. Let children use under the guidance of adults. And what do we do in the case of child-headed families where this is used as a resource to survive? Do we criminalize that? I don't think so. So I agree very much with Paul about legitimate regulation. There should be
Pilasande, we just lost your sound. Okay.
Legitimate regulation when it comes, that should come in on this. should be business, small business, township and rural economy, health, of course, but those are the ones that I feel are the most important. Thank you.
Thanks, Pelasandi. Anyone else on any of the points or questions in the chat line?
If I may, I mean, there's suggestion that the what's holding us back? Why isn't this being opened up? And I think that there's very, very good reason to believe that there are some, as is the case in many industries and many aspects of life in South Africa. I think that the forthcoming industry may already have been captured. And to the extent that I know anything, I don't want to say too much because to be honest, fear for my life. But if there are investigative journalists out there, you should be investigating this because the industry has already been captured, and that is probably the answer as to why it is being held back, because the people want all of their ducks in a row so that when a very difficult to break into industry is created, those ducks are already in a row for a select few of very well connected individuals.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're touching on something of importance here, that yes, there's an existing industry, but when we legalize it for the first time, there's an opportunity to shape it in a particular way, an opportunity we will never have again. It will be locked into a particular mode. And I think that's, for me, where even this first bill becomes very important, because what path does it set us on? They can say they're going to come with other bills, but this one sets a particular path and tone. Suresh, you wanted to comment that, or you were just nodding enthusiastically?
Enthusiastically, but there was a comment I wanted to make. So in our manifesto, we actually speak about a hub model. So essentially, it's a farmers cooperative model, similar to something that we'd find in the tobacco industry in Zimbabwe. This is actually made up of thousands of small-scale farmers, all centrally sending their product to a central processing distribution hub. And we feel from a practical point of view that could be something that could be implemented in South Africa. And yes, like if someone wants to be a big corporate and invest hundreds of millions into their business, they should be free to do so. But we should allow co-op models and the hub model to coexist alongside it. That's just my only comment on that.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else on that? Or on any of the other points that have been raised also in the chat line as well? There was also a point from Tafadzwa saying that, can we learn from legalizing in other spaces like rhino horn, wildlife trade, and so on? Is there anything we can learn from those in looking at how we legalize the cannabis industry? And I also saw someone referring to the California experience. Apparently 70% of cannabis sold in California is still illegal due to over-regulation. We should learn from this. Over-regulation will not work. So any thoughts on that, sort of learning from other places or other sectors in terms of how we could handle these things? Not from the panelists for now.
I will say one thing. If we learn, not necessarily with what other jurisdictions have done with cannabis, but if we can go back to a prohibition that we all know about, the prohibition of alcohol in 1920s America. Yeah. What happened there? People started producing moonshine because you might have gotten rid of the legitimate supply, but you certainly didn't get rid of the demand. People were then paid exorbitant prices for the moonshine, and that was a great source of income for the criminal underworld. So one of the best things that you can do, and it'll never go away, the black market entirely, but one of the best things you can do, for example, using the rhino horn example that was brought up, is to completely legitimize the trade in a commodity, and you then do away with the black market almost overnight. You don't eliminate it, but certainly why are you going to pay for expensive black market cannabis if cannabis is freely available at a reasonable price all over the place? So that might be something that's worth keeping in mind, is the lessons that we learned 100 years ago, in fact, from the United States.
Yeah, And I think Trenton is also pointing to those more recent lessons in the cannabis space. And you can regulate it, but if you regulate it too tightly, you're not going to achieve the purposes you might want. So in the last few minutes, let me just give a chance for each of the panelists to leave us with a last message, just a short 30-second or so message from each of the panelists. Pilar Sande, your last message in this webinar?
I just think that the government right now, should allow our people to grow. Obviously, we're talking about adults, to grow and be able to sell cannabis to each other, because it's already happening in the black market. Whether we like it or not, the black market is there. People are buying cannabis every day, and this money is being exported out of the country for other criminal uses. So why aren't our people being given a chance to exploit this opportunity right now?
Okay, thank you. Tracy?
Well, just to say that, yeah, I think that the bill it's way too punitive. It focuses way too much on the penalties. It's also discriminatory. And I think that it needs to definitely open up or make provision for academic and scientific research into the use of cannabis so that we can, so we can expand on this strategy as well. But yeah, that's all from me.
Thank you. Paul Michael?
Just really that it would be very nice if government was more forthcoming with its thinking, what it is that it's trying to achieve with pieces of legislation like this, because we're having this debate completely in a vacuum. None of us have any insights or direct insights into what government's thinking. And it would have been refreshing, I suppose, to have had them on this debate so that we weren't left scratching our heads. And I think that the reason that they didn't come onto this debate with the greatest of respect is because they wouldn't have been able to really answer that question convincingly as to what are you really trying to achieve for the benefit of the people who voted you into power.
Thank you. And I'll give the last word to Suresh.
Yeah, I think it's just building on what Paul Michael said. We can have all these great discussions, but we really need a platform to be able to openly engage with government, and we don't see that yet. Maybe we do in the future, but I think this journey is going to be a long-term project. Yeah, 2021 will be an interesting year for cannabis.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to all the panelists, and thank you to all the participants. Building on what Suresh just said, I hope that University of Pretoria can contribute to creating those platforms, at least for discussion on these issues. And we look at, let's maximize the opportunities and also deal with the risks that are there. And so from my side, thank you very much to everybody. The recording will be made available and shared, and and please, I hope we'll see you all again in future such discussions on the cannabis sector and cannabis, the plant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for inviting me for this, and thank you to the panelists as well for speaking.
Cool.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Sebonga.
Bye. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Pilar Sande. Your sound was fine.